The night her farm burned to ashes, she knocked on her daughter's door for shelter, and was turned away over a $15,000 rug. What her family didn't know: the homeless woman they rejected had one phone call that would change everything. The night her daughter closed the door, she didn't just lose shelter. She lost the last illusion she had about what family meant. A 64-year-old woman stood on a spotless suburban porch, smoke still clinging to her hair from the wildfire that had erased her entire farm that same afternoon. 43 years of work. Her late husband's orchard. The barn beams he built with his own hands. All gone in a wall of flame and wind. She knocked on her only child's door because there was nowhere else to go. And her son-in-law looked at her soot-stained jeans, glanced down at his polished hardwood floors and said, "You'll ruin my Persian rug. I can't have a homeless woman sleeping on my couch." Homeless woman. Not Mom. Not Ada. Not the woman who worked 3 jobs after her husband died. Just homeless. I have been drawn to family stories for as long as I can remember. Not because they're dramatic, but because they reveal who we are when comfort disappears. When status cracks. When we are forced to choose between image and loyalty. And this story, Ada's story, has stayed with me because it asks a question most of us avoid. When everything you built burns down, who opens the door? Welcome to Empathetic Story. I'm glad you're here. I don't tell stories like this to judge anyone. I tell them because I want to understand them. I want to understand how a daughter can grow up watching her mother work until her hands cracked, and still hesitate when that same mother shows up needing help. I want to understand how fear of embarrassment can outweigh decades of sacrifice. And I want to understand what happens next. Because what her daughter didn't know that night, what no one in that manicured neighborhood knew, was that Ada had one number saved in her phone. A name she hadn't dialed in 15 years. A name connected to a different version of family. But before we get there, I need you to sit with this porch scene a little longer. Imagine standing outside your child's home with nothing but a duffel bag and the smell of smoke in your clothes. Imagine explaining that the insurance company needs months, that the farm is gone, that you just need a few days to breathe. And instead of being asked, "Are you okay?" you are measured against a rug. I keep replaying that moment in my head, not because of the cruelty of it, but because of the silence that followed. Her daughter didn't scream. She didn't defend her. She didn't even argue loudly. She stood there, torn between discomfort and compliance. If you've ever experienced someone you love choosing silence when you needed defense, you know that silence can feel louder than insult. The door closed. Not slammed in rage. Closed in decision. There's something about doors closing that feels final, isn't there? It's not just wood and hinges. It's a line being drawn. It's a message that says, your need disrupts our comfort. And here's what unsettles me most. The wildfire didn't destroy Ada's identity. The rejection almost did. In this country we praise independence. We admire people who handle their own problems. We quietly shame dependency. But we rarely talk about what happens when life humbles someone who has already given everything. Ada wasn't irresponsible. She wasn't reckless. She was aging. She was widowed. She was uninsured against the kind of disaster that turned sky into fire. But in that moment none of that mattered. What mattered was appearance. Image matters, her son-in-law had said. That phrase echoes louder than the helicopter that would later land in that same neighborhood. Image matters. I've been thinking about that sentence ever since I first heard this story. Because image often becomes a shield for people who have climbed out of struggle and are terrified of sliding back down. Sometimes, when someone escapes poverty or instability, they don't just leave it behind, they reject it. They treat it like contamination. And when that past shows up at the door in soot-covered jeans, panic sets in. Was it cruelty? Or fear? Was it indifference? Or shame? These are the questions that keep me leaning into stories like this instead of walking away. Because family isn't just about love. It's about values under pressure. And pressure had just revealed something. But what happened next revealed something else entirely. After the door closed, Ada stood on that porch for several minutes. Through the frosted glass, she could see shadows moving inside, warm lights familiar. Silhouettes, the life she thought she would always be part of. Then her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter. Maybe this is the wake-up call you need to plan your future more responsibly. That line didn't just hurt. It reframed her entire past as failure. I don't know about you, but when I hear that, I don't feel anger first. I feel grief. Grief for the misunderstanding. Grief for the years of sacrifice that were never fully seen. But here's where the story turns. Because sitting in that pickup truck, hands shaking, dignity bruised, Ada scrolled through her contacts and stopped at a name that had been quiet for 15 years. Thomas Peterson. The boy next door. The child she fed at her kitchen table. The one who once told her, "Someone should take care of you too." She hesitated. And then she pressed call. If you want to know what real loyalty looks like, stay with me. Because the voice that answered that phone didn't just change her circumstances. It exposed the difference between blood and gratitude. And if stories like this move you, if you believe empathy matters more than image, subscribe to the channel. Your support gives this space the momentum to keep telling the stories that make us think deeper and feel honestly. Now let's talk about the years no one saw. Before we can understand why that door closed so quickly, we have to step back into the years when it was still open. I keep returning to that image of Ada standing alone in her truck, because moments like that don't grow overnight. They are cultivated quietly, through small shifts in perception, through years of unspoken resentment, through sacrifices that go unseen. Frank died when Kalia was 12. I try to remember what 12 felt like, old enough to understand death, young enough to still need protection from it. Ada didn't just lose a husband. She lost the buffer between survival and collapse. The farm was already financially fragile. The orchard needed tending. The cattle needed feeding. Debt doesn't pause for grief. So she worked. Not in the abstract way people summarize struggle, but in the granular, exhausting way that shapes bone and posture. Early mornings at Murphy's Diner. Afternoons cleaning houses in neighborhoods where countertops gleamed and refrigerators were always full. Occasional night shifts at a textile plant when extra hours were available. I don't romanticize that kind of labor. It wears you down. It makes your hands ache and your back stiff. It leaves grease in your hair and fatigue in your eyes. But to Ada it was simple. Her daughter would not feel the instability she felt. Here's what complicates that intention. Children don't always interpret sacrifice as love. Sometimes they interpret it as evidence that something is wrong. Kalia grew up watching her mother come home exhausted. She watched her remove her shoes slowly, rub her temples, and still ask about homework. She watched her stretch every dollar and pretend it was enough. But as Kalia entered her teenage years, something subtle began forming inside her. A kind of quiet humiliation. She noticed the other mothers at school events. Their manicured nails. Their polished cars. The way they seemed unhurried. She noticed which houses her friends preferred to hang out in, and which houses they avoided. And gradually she started choosing distance. When she said it was easier to spend time at friends' homes, what she meant was that those homes felt safe from judgment. Ada's farm, with its aging paint and visible wear, felt like exposure. This is the part of the story that makes me uncomfortable in a productive way. Because I don't believe Kalia was cruel as a teenager. I believe she was absorbing the messages around her. In America, we don't just teach ambition. We teach comparison. We teach that upward mobility is proof of worth. We teach that struggle is something to outgrow, not something to honor. So when you grow up in scarcity, you sometimes develop a vow. I will never be that vulnerable again. I think Kalia made that vow long before she met Louis. Ada shielded her daughter from the full weight of their financial strain. She never described the nights she cried in the dark after double shifts. She never confessed how often she skipped proper meals to stretch the grocery budget. She believed protection meant silence. But silence has consequences. When sacrifice is invisible, gratitude doesn't always root deeply. Kalia saw effort. She did not see cost. And over time, she began associating the farm not with resilience, but with limitation. Not with love but with social risk. I've seen this pattern before. Children of hardship sometimes split their identities in two. The child who endured, and the adult who distances themselves from that endurance as quickly as possible. Louis entered her life during that transitional phase. He was ambitious, polished, deliberate about appearances. He spoke confidently about networking, reputation, presentation. To someone who had grown up feeling exposed, that kind of clarity feels like security. And I can't help but wonder whether Kalia fell in love with Louis, or with the version of herself she became standing next to him. When she moved into Woodlawn Estates, she didn't just change addresses. She redefined herself. New house, new social circle, new expectations. She curated an identity that felt insulated from embarrassment. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When people rebuild themselves around image, they sometimes begin to see vulnerability as threat. So when Ada appeared that night, not composed, not polished but raw from disaster, she didn't just represent need. She represented the version of Kalia that once felt small. Fear often disguises itself as coldness. I believe that when Kalia hesitated at the door, she wasn't calculating inheritance or money. She was calculating perception. What would neighbors think? What would colleagues say if someone saw her mother looking displaced? And I want to be clear. Understanding that fear does not excuse what happened, but it explains the emotional soil it grew from. Ada still saw her daughter as the child who once crawled into her bed during thunderstorms. Parents freeze their children in earlier versions. They remember scraped knees and bedtime stories. Children, on the other hand, often remember the stress in their parents' voices, the exhaustion, the way financial worry lingered in the air. Those mismatched memories collide when crisis hits. When the wildfire erased the farm, Ada thought she was turning toward safety. Kalia saw the return of instability. And in that split second on the porch, years of unexamined shame spoke louder than decades of sacrifice. That's why I say we have to look at the years no one saw. Because the door didn't close only because of one sentence about a rug. It closed because a daughter who had built her identity around escaping hardship panicked when hardship appeared again. But there was another child in those years who interpreted everything differently. While Kalia was distancing herself from the smell of grease and the sight of worn wood, a boy next door was watching Ada's consistency with quiet reverence. And that difference between shame and gratitude would determine who answered the phone when she finally called. And while Kalia was quietly distancing herself from the life she had grown up in, there was another child standing just outside that same life, watching it with entirely different eyes. Tommy Peterson lived next door to the farm, in a house that always seemed slightly tilted, physically and emotionally. The porch boards sagged. The yard was patchy. The lights inside flickered unpredictably, not because of wiring issues alone, but because stability was never guaranteed there. His parents drank more than they spoke. Arguments carried through thin walls. Silence followed like a bruise. Everyone in town knew. No one intervened. That detail always lingers with me, because it says something about how communities normalize dysfunction as long as it stays contained. Tommy's hunger wasn't dramatic enough to make headlines. It was the quieter kind. The kind that shows up as an 8-year-old boy hovering around someone else's kitchen at dinner time. He would knock on Ada's back door with small excuses. Do you have extra sugar? Can I help with chores? My dad said I should ask if you need anything. The words changed. The pattern didn't. Ada saw through it immediately. I don't think she ever formally decided to take him in. It wasn't discussed in grand speeches. It unfolded naturally the way compassion often does. An extra plate at the table. A blanket folded quietly in the barn when the shouting next door got too loud. Homework spread across the same wooden kitchen table where bills were stacked in quiet worry. What moves me about this part of the story isn't the generosity itself. It's the consistency. Ada didn't help Tommy once. She helped him repeatedly. She didn't rescue him from his parents. She offered steadiness within the chaos. And steadiness, when you grow up without it, feels revolutionary. Tommy watched everything. He watched Ada come home tired from the diner and still ask about spelling tests. He watched her count change carefully before grocery trips. He watched her rise before dawn to tend animals even after working late. Where Kalia saw embarrassment, Tommy saw endurance. That distinction matters more than we like to admit. Because children interpret the same environment through different emotional filters. Kalia's filter was comparison. Tommy's was gratitude. After Frank died, Tommy's presence at the farm increased. He helped with chores before school without being asked. Fed the chickens. Carried hay bales that were slightly too heavy for his frame. When Ada told him he didn't have to, he shrugged and said, "I like helping." But one afternoon he said something that stayed with her. "You take care of everyone else." Someone should take care of you too. I think about that sentence often. It didn't come from obligation. Came from observation. An 8-year-old had noticed what many adults overlook, that Ada was always extending herself outward. And that observation shaped him. He began doing homework at her kitchen table regularly. The table became a silent witness to both struggle and possibility. While Ada worried about property taxes and feed costs, Tommy taught himself programming from library books. While Kalia withdrew to avoid social embarrassment, Tommy leaned in, absorbing every small lesson about responsibility and loyalty. Here's something I've learned from studying stories like this. Gratitude forms when kindness intersects with vulnerability at the right time. Tommy wasn't just fed. He was seen. And being seen as worthy when your own household treats you as background noise creates a different kind of bond. By 15, Tommy was repairing neighbors' computers for pocket money. By 16, teachers were talking about his aptitude in ways that surprised even them. By 17, he had earned a full scholarship to MIT. Small-town miracle stories often gloss over the details. But this one didn't begin in a lab or a venture capital office. It began at a wooden kitchen table where someone chose to treat him like family long before success was visible. The night before he left for college, he and Ada sat on the porch as the sun sank behind the fields. He held a thermos of coffee in both hands like it grounded him. "I wouldn't have made it without you," he said. Ada, in typical fashion, tried to deflect it. "You would have found a way." But he shook his head. "You gave me something I never had before. You gave me a family." That word family means different things depending on who says it. To Kalia it was inheritance and obligation. To Tommy it was shelter and loyalty. When he left for MIT he stayed in touch for a while. Holiday cards, updates about classes, mentions of internships. Then life accelerated, as it tends to do for young people chasing opportunity. Communication thinned. Years passed. 15 of them. Ada never leveraged his success socially. She didn't brag about knowing a tech founder. She didn't name drop in church circles. She simply kept his number saved in her phone, like a bookmark in a chapter she assumed had closed. And this is what I find most revealing. She didn't see him as an insurance policy. She saw him as a child she had once chosen. Meanwhile, Tommy carried something forward from that farm into every boardroom he later entered. Not just ambition. Not just intelligence. But a blueprint of what loyalty looked like when no one was watching. Wealth amplifies whatever foundation you build it on. If resentment shapes you early, success makes you sharper. If gratitude shapes you early, success makes you steadier. When Ada sat in her truck that night after being turned away, she wasn't thinking about net worth. She was thinking about the boy who once said someone should take care of her too. She hesitated before calling him because 15 years is a long time. Time can erode closeness. It can distort memory. But some imprints don't fade. And when she finally pressed that call button, she wasn't reaching toward power. She was reaching toward proof. Proof that the love she gave had not evaporated into nothing. Proof that chosen family might respond differently than blood. And in the next moment when the phone began to ring, we were about to see which interpretation of family would answer. And when she finally pressed that call button, what she was really testing was not wealth but memory. The phone rang longer than she expected. There is a particular kind of silence that fills a car at night, when you are waiting to see whether someone will answer you. It is not just quiet. It is suspended judgment. Every ring carries a question. Did I matter enough to be remembered? By the third ring, Ada almost ended the call. Rejection has a way of retraining your expectations. After being turned away once, you begin bracing for it again. Then he picked up. "Hello." His voice was deeper now, older, polished by years and distance. But when she said, "Tommy, it's Ada," something changed instantly. "Miss Ada." It wasn't the words themselves. It was the tone. Recognition. Urgency. Concern. "Are you okay?" That was his first question. Not "where have you been?" Not "why are you calling after 15 years?" Not "what do you need?" "Are you okay?" I keep returning to that detail because it reveals something foundational. When someone's first instinct is to assess your well-being, you are not a transaction to them. You are history. Ada tried to keep her voice steady as she explained. The fire. The farm. The insurance delay. The door that did not open. The word homeless hanging heavier than the smoke still clinging to her clothes. He didn't interrupt. There is a difference between listening to respond and listening to absorb. Tommy absorbed. When she finished, there was a pause. Not hesitation, processing. Where are you right now? She told him she was still in her truck. I need you to drive to the Marriott 20 miles north. I'm booking you a suite. You're not paying for anything. You're getting a hot shower and real sleep tonight. She began to protest because that's what people who have lived in scarcity do. They calculate costs before comfort. Tommy, I can't. Yes, you can, he said gently. You took care of me when I had nothing. Let me take care of you now. That line shifted the axis of the conversation. Not charity. Continuity. What moves me most here is not the offer of luxury. It's the language of return. He did not frame himself as savior. He framed himself as reciprocal. Then he added something that made the air feel different. I'm flying out in the morning. I'll be there by noon. There are moments when loyalty is verbal, and there are moments when it is physical. Flying across the country on short notice is not symbolic support. It is presence. I've thought about that decision often. Successful people are busy. Schedules are tight. Assistants filter calls. But gratitude interrupts routine. Tommy, you don't have to, she said. Yes, I do. 3 words. Calm. Unshakable. Before they hung up, he said there was something else she needed to know. The company he had started after MIT hadn't just survived. It had expanded beyond anything she could have imagined. Investors. Acquisitions. Market shifts that worked in his favor. His name had appeared in business publications. Forbes had estimated his net worth at $2.8 billion. Billion. When I say that word, I don't say it with awe. I say it with context. Because money in this story is not about extravagance. It is about leverage. It is about how power behaves. When it intersects with memory, wealth does not create character. It magnifies it. If Tommy had forgotten that kitchen table, $2 billion would not have restored it. If he had internalized entitlement instead of gratitude, success would have hardened him. Instead, it steadied him. Tomorrow, he said quietly, we're going to have a conversation. He did not use the word revenge. He did not use the word confrontation. He used conversation. But beneath that word was clarity. From now on, you will never worry about having a roof over your head again. That promise was not theatrical. It was matter of fact. Like he was stating an obvious correction to an error in the universe. Ada drove to the hotel in a kind of emotional haze. The room waiting for her felt unreal. White sheets, polished surfaces. A view that stretched beyond the small-town horizon she had known her entire life. But what stayed with her was not the marble bathroom or the room service menu. It was the feeling of being chosen. The next morning her phone rang just before noon. I just landed, he said. Not my flight landed. I landed. Subtle language carries power. When she stepped outside the hotel lobby, she heard the rhythmic thud of helicopter blades cutting through open air. People gathered instinctively. Heads tilted upward. Phones raised. The aircraft descended smoothly onto the grass, controlled and deliberate. It did not feel chaotic. Felt precise. When the door opened and Tommy stepped out, he looked like someone accustomed to commanding rooms. Tailored suit. Confident posture. The kind of composure that comes from knowing you are no longer vulnerable to circumstance. But when he saw her, the formality dissolved. Miss Ada. He closed the distance between them and embraced her like no time had passed at all. That hug is the detail I hold on to. Because helicopters impress crowds. But continuity impresses me. Before they boarded again, he looked at her and said something I believe every parent needs to hear at least once in their life. You don't owe anyone explanations. You don't owe anyone anything. For decades, she had equated love with obligation. Now someone was separating the two. The flight back toward Woodlawn Estates took only minutes. But it carried 15 years of memory, gratitude, and accumulated power. And as the neighborhood below came into view, pristine and predictable, I couldn't help but think this wasn't just a return. It was a reckoning shaped not by anger, but by loyalty that had waited patiently for its moment to answer the call. As the helicopter descended toward the quiet order of Woodlawn Estates, It wasn't just air being displaced, it was hierarchy. From above, the neighborhood looked symmetrical. Trimmed lawns, identical roofs, controlled landscaping. The kind of place designed to communicate stability without saying a word. But stability built on image can be fragile when truth lands in the middle of it. When the helicopter touched down near the park across from Kalia's house, people stepped outside instinctively.
Curiosity travels fast in affluent neighborhoods.
The sound alone was enough to fracture routine. Kalia and Louis stood in their driveway. Confusion was written across their faces first. Then recognition. Then something harder to name, calculation maybe. I've seen that look before. It's the look of someone trying to adjust quickly to a new power dynamic. Tommy stepped out first, steady and composed. Then he turned and helped Ada down carefully, not because she was incapable, but because respect is visible in gestures. As they crossed the street together, I couldn't help thinking about how different this walk was from the night before. That night Ada had walked alone. This time she walked accompanied, not just by wealth, but by someone who had chosen her publicly. "Mom!" Kalia called out, her voice unsure. It wasn't accusation. It wasn't affection. It was uncertainty. Louis attempted authority. "What is going on here?" Tommy stopped a few feet away. He didn't rush the moment. He didn't perform it either. There was no need. "Mrs. Morrison," he said calmly, looking at Kalia. "I believe you met my mother last night." "My mother." That reframing landed quietly but decisively. I watched this part of the story unfold in my mind many times, and what strikes me most is how language shifts identity. The woman who had been labeled a liability hours earlier was now being identified as someone central. Louis tried to steady himself. "I don't know who you think you are." "Thomas Peterson," Tommy replied, extending his hand. "I grew up next door." The name settled heavily. In small towns, success stories echo. The kid who left. The scholarship to MIT. The tech founder whose company expanded beyond state lines. Louis knew the name. You could see the recognition sharpen his posture. But Tommy didn't lean into intimidation. He leaned into memory. "She fed me when my own parents wouldn't," he continued. "She helped me with homework at her kitchen table. She worked harder than anyone I've ever known. And she made room for me when she barely had room for herself." Notice what he centered. Not his wealth. Her character. I've always believed that true power doesn't shout. It narrates calmly. Louis cleared his throat. "This is a private family matter." Tommy nodded. "Exactly. That's why I'm here." The neighbors had drawn closer now, their quiet distance shrinking into audible range. Phones were visible. Reputation was listening. And here's what I find revealing. Louis's confidence the night before had come from isolation. He had assumed the moment would stay behind closed doors. Public light changes tone. "You called her homeless," Tommy said evenly. "You were concerned about a rug. She had just lost her home." There was no anger in his voice, just fact. And facts, when spoken without hostility, are harder to deflect. Then came the shift. Tommy reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. "This is the deed to a house about an hour from here. 10 acres. Full-time staff. If she wants it, it's hers." Silence fell across the driveway. Not shock alone but recalibration. But he wasn't finished. "I've also established a trust fund in her name. $25 million. You could feel the air change. Money has a way of commanding attention in spaces built on status. But what mattered to me in that moment wasn't the number. It was the reversal. Hours earlier, Ada had been evaluated based on what she lacked. Now she was beyond evaluation. Louis's composure thinned. Kalia's face flushed. Not just with embarrassment, but with something closer to realization. "Mom," she said, stepping forward slightly. "Can we talk?" The tone was different now. Softer.
Urgent.
Ada turned toward her, and what I admire most about her in this moment is what she didn't do. She didn't smirk. She didn't scold. She didn't recount every sacrifice. She asked gently, "About what?" Tommy spoke before the conversation could slide into revision. "A mistake is forgetting to return a call," he said. "Last night wasn't a mistake. It was a choice." That line holds weight. We excuse mistakes. We live with choices. I've spent years listening to family stories, and one pattern repeats. People are quick to reclassify choices as mistakes once consequences appear. But accountability begins when we call actions what they are. The neighbors were no longer pretending to water plants or check mail. They were witnesses. In communities where image is currency, public exposure alters trajectories. Promotions stall. Invitations shrink. Trust erodes. But what moved me most was not the spectacle. It was the clarity. Tommy turned to Ada. "You don't owe anyone anything," he reminded her. And in that moment the balance of emotional power shifted entirely. As the helicopter blades began turning again, Kalia's voice cut through the noise. "I made a mistake," she called out. Ada looked at her daughter, not with fury, but with understanding sharpened by pain. Some realizations arrived too late to undo impact. As they lifted off, I thought about what had just unfolded. Not revenge. Revelation. Revelation of priorities. Revelation of character under pressure. Revelation that loyalty, when nurtured quietly over years, does not evaporate, it waits. And as Woodlawn Estates returned to stillness, one thing was certain. The night before had exposed vulnerability. This afternoon had exposed values. But the real transformation was yet to come. Not in public driveways, but in private decisions about forgiveness, responsibility, and what it truly means to love without erasing yourself. If the confrontation in the driveway was the loud part of the story, what followed was quieter, and far more revealing. Public reckoning satisfies the onlookers. Private consequences test the soul. In the months after the helicopter left Woodlawn Estates, Ada's life shifted in ways that would have felt impossible a year earlier. The new home Tommy placed in her name was spacious, calm, almost disorienting in its steadiness. 10 acres of land, a wraparound porch, staff who addressed her with respect instead of impatience. It would have been easy to interpret this as a fairy tale ending. But that's not how I see it. What moved me wasn't the square footage or the trust fund. It was what Ada did with the space. She did not transform overnight into someone unrecognizable. She didn't adopt extravagance. She didn't reinvent herself around wealth. Instead, she carried forward the same habits she had always had. Early mornings, simple meals, handwritten notes of thanks. The difference was this. For the first time in decades, she wasn't operating from depletion. Tommy visited often. Sometimes weekly, sometimes more when his schedule allowed. He would sit at her kitchen table, the old one salvaged from the farm ruins, and work quietly while she cooked. The scene felt almost unchanged from years earlier. Except now his laptop represented decisions that shaped industries. That table, scarred and rescued from ashes, became symbolic to me. It connected who they were to who they had become. Success had expanded their circumstances, but it had not erased their origin. Meanwhile, life in Woodlawn Estates did not remain untouched. Reputation is delicate in communities built on presentation. Word of the driveway confrontation spread, not through scandalous headlines, but through conversation. In professional environments where trust and perception intertwine, character assessments travel faster than press releases. Louis began to feel subtle shifts.
Client hésitait.
A promotion he once assumed would be automatic dissolved into ambiguity. Invitations slowed. Business conversations grew cooler. I don't see this as cosmic punishment. I see it as social recalibration. When someone reveals what they value under pressure, others adjust accordingly. Eventually, Louis filed for divorce. Kalia moved out. The large house became unsustainable without the image it once protected. The car was sold. The neighborhood distanced itself. And then one afternoon there was a knock at Ada's new front door. Not dramatic. Not desperate. Measured. When Ada opened it, Kalia stood there, smaller somehow, not physically but in certainty. Gone were the carefully curated edges. What replaced them was something rawer. "I need to talk," she said. I've replayed that moment in my mind more than the helicopter landing. Because this is where the story moves from spectacle to substance. Kalia explained the divorce. The apartment above a laundromat. The return to Murphy's diner for work. The irony of standing behind the same counter her mother once stood behind. There was embarrassment in her voice. And something else, fatigue. "I made a mistake," she said. Here is where I slow down because I believe this distinction matters deeply. Was it a mistake? Or was it a choice that produced consequences she hadn't anticipated? Ada didn't rush to absolve her. She didn't weaponize the past either. She listened. Listening without rushing to fix. That is a discipline most parents struggle with. I forgive you, Ada said eventually, and I think that's important. Forgiveness happened internally before this conversation. It was not conditional on apology. It was not dependent on financial reversal. It was a decision to release bitterness. But then she said something that reshaped the room. Forgiveness isn't rescue. That line is the moral center of this chapter. For decades, Ada had equated love with protection. She shielded her daughter from financial strain, emotional burden, social embarrassment. Protection had been her instinct. Now she understood something different. Rescuing someone from the consequences of their choices can prevent growth. Kalia asked if she could move in. The question wasn't unreasonable. It was natural. When life collapses, we look for safety. But Ada saw clearly now that safety without reflection can repeat the same pattern. You're my daughter, she said. But the relationship we had before doesn't exist anymore. It changed the night you closed that door. Not said in anger. Said in clarity. There's a difference. What I find profound is that Ada did not mirror what had been done to her. She did not close her door out of vengeance. She kept it open, but she did not step aside. That distinction defines maturity. You can keep a door open without surrendering your boundaries. Kalia cried. She spoke about shame. About growing up promising she would never feel small again. About how seeing her mother arrive in crisis triggered fear she had never examined. And this is where empathy complicates judgment. I don't believe Kalia lacked love. I believe she lacked self-awareness. Fear had shaped her choices. And fear unexamined becomes cruelty disguised as practicality. Ada reached across the space between them and asked the question that cut through performance. Do you want me in your life because you love me? Or because you see what my connection to Tommy provides? Silence followed. Not defiance. Not manipulation. Silence born from self-confrontation. Sometimes growth begins in silence. Ada did not offer financial solutions. She did not extend the trust fund. She did not co-sign an apartment. She offered something else. You have to build your life in a way that doesn't depend on avoiding shame. That sentence feels simple. It is not. It requires courage to rebuild without leaning on what you once rejected. After Kalia left, Ada sat alone for a long time. Not angry. Not triumphant. Reflective. Because choosing not to rescue someone you love is emotionally complex. It requires you to tolerate their discomfort without absorbing it as your own. Tommy supported her decision. You spent 30 years giving, he told her gently. You don't have to keep proving your love through sacrifice. That affirmation matters. Because many parents believe sacrifice is the only proof of devotion. Ada was learning something new. Love can exist alongside boundaries. Forgiveness can coexist with accountability. And sometimes the most compassionate act is stepping back long enough for someone else to face themselves. The spectacle of wealth had already passed. Now came the harder work. Redefining what family meant when love was no longer unconditional access. And in that redefinition, Ada was not becoming colder. She was becoming clearer. And it was in that clarity, not the helicopter, not the trust fund, that Ada's real transformation began. 6 months later, if you visited her new home, you wouldn't immediately see a woman rescued by wealth. You would see a woman restored to herself. The porch overlooked rolling hills instead of scorched farmland. The mornings were quieter. There was no frantic calculation about feed costs or insurance timelines. But what struck me most wasn't the comfort. It was the steadiness. Ada had spent decades reacting to debt, to widowhood, to exhaustion, to her daughter's needs. Now, for the first time, she was choosing deliberately. Tommy's foundation for single mothers had grown rapidly. What began as a scholarship initiative expanded into emergency housing funds, childcare grants, and educational programs in rural communities. Women wrote letters describing double shifts, medical bills, eviction notices. Their handwriting often trembled in the same way Ada's had trembled when she signed loan extensions years earlier. Tommy asked her to join the board formally, not as a symbolic figure, as a voice. I find that significant. He did not see her as someone to be cared for alone. He saw her as someone whose experience carried weight. At fundraising events when he introduced her, he didn't list her as a beneficiary or a relative. He said, "This is the woman who taught me what loyalty looks like." That sentence moved rooms more than any net worth statistic ever could. At one gala in San Francisco, Ada stood on stage in a gown she would never have imagined wearing during her diner shifts. The room was filled with investors, executives, and public figures. But when she spoke, she didn't reference helicopters or trust funds. She spoke about dignity. She spoke about what it feels like to work yourself into exhaustion and still wonder if you are enough. She spoke about the difference between assistance and respect. $12 million were raised that night for women she would never meet. And as she stepped down from the stage, I thought about the invisible arc of her life. From scrubbing other people's kitchens to shaping philanthropic decisions that altered other women's futures. This is where I believe the story finds its true center. Not in the reversal of fortune, in the redefinition of worth. Meanwhile, Kalia's journey unfolded more slowly. She called often at first. Voicemails layered with apology and urgency. Ada listened to some, deleted others. She did not block her daughter's number. She simply refused to let guilt dictate access. Through mutual acquaintances, she learned that Kalia was working long hours again. That she had begun saving money carefully. That she rarely mentioned Woodlawn Estates anymore. Growth rarely announces itself loudly. It looks like repetition. It looks like humility practiced daily. One afternoon months later, Kalia showed up again. No polished speech. No appeal to inheritance. Just quiet presence. "I'm trying," she said. Ada believed her. But belief did not require reversal. Here is what I have learned from watching this story unfold. Forgiveness can free your heart without reopening old dynamics. Ada forgave her daughter because carrying resentment would have tethered her to the past. But she did not resume the role of rescuer. She did not fund the rebuilding. She did not absorb responsibility for choices that were not hers. Instead, she offered conversation, guidance, emotional availability, and that difference changed the tone of their relationship entirely. Tommy continued visiting regularly. Sometimes he would bring colleagues to meet her. Powerful individuals who shook her hand with genuine respect. Not because of her proximity to wealth but because they had heard the stories. The old farmhouse kitchen table sat in her new home, restored carefully. Its surface bore scratches and marks from decades of use. It reminded her and everyone who saw it that legacy is not built in grand gestures. It is built in small, consistent acts of care. When I reflect on Ada's journey, what stays with me isn't the image of the helicopter in the sky. It's the image of that table. Because that table represents the kind of family she built quietly, without expectation of return. Tommy's success did not erase what happened on the porch that night. It illuminated it. It showed that loyalty nurtured in obscurity can outlast blood bound by expectation. And, perhaps most importantly, it showed that dignity is not something someone else grants you. It is something you reclaim when you stop bargaining it away. I used to believe that the most satisfying ending to a family story was reconciliation. Everyone reunited. Tears. Restoration. But I see it differently now. Sometimes the most honest ending is recalibration. Ada did not lose her daughter entirely. She lost the illusion that love required self-erasure. She gained something more durable. Self-respect. Chosen loyalty. A legacy that extended beyond inheritance and into impact. So let me ask you something, not as a narrator collecting comments, but as someone who genuinely wrestles with these questions. If you were standing on that porch and the door closed, who would you call? And if someone who once carried you through your hardest years showed up at your door, what would you protect first, your image or your gratitude? Family, I've learned, is not defined solely by blood. It is defined by who shows up when showing up costs something. And Ada's story reminds me that sometimes the people we choose, and who choose us back, become the truest inheritance we will ever have. When I step back and look at Ada's story as a whole, what stays with me isn't the wildfire, or even the helicopter. It's the quiet shift that happened inside her. She lost her farm, yes. She lost the illusion that her daughter would always choose her. But she did not lose her worth. In fact, that crisis forced her to see something she had overlooked for decades. Love that requires you to shrink is not love that sustains you. The boy she once fed at her kitchen table grew into a man who understood loyalty not as obligation, but as gratitude. And the daughter she protected from hardship had to confront what happens when image matters more than empathy. Ada's journey wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity. Clarity about who shows up. Clarity about the difference between forgiveness and rescue. Clarity that dignity does not disappear when someone closes a door on you. Sometimes that door reveals who truly belongs in your life. The deeper lesson here is this. Boundaries are not bitterness. Forgiveness is not financial support. And family is not automatically defined by blood. It is defined by consistent care, especially when no one is watching. In our own lives, this means we must examine where we are overgiving to earn love. It means asking whether we are choosing image over empathy. It means having the courage to forgive without re-entering unhealthy dynamics. Practically, that could look like setting clear emotional boundaries, refusing to enable repeated disrespect, or expressing gratitude more openly to the people who stood by us quietly. Growth begins when we stop confusing sacrifice with self-worth. Now I want to hear from you. In one sentence, what do you think truly defines a real family? Please share your thoughts respectfully in the comments so others can reflect on different perspectives. And if stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support keeps Empathetic Story growing and allows us to continue exploring the kind of narratives that challenge us to think deeper and live wiser.